Betrayal tastes like cold ash and cheap wine. On the morning she was meant to marry a monster to save her family, she found her sister wearing her gown, silk laced too tight, pearls pinned into golden hair instead of brown. It wasn't about love, it was about power. Her sister wanted a crown, even a cursed one. So she let her take it. She just didn't expect the Alpha King to smell the lie the moment he walked in. Morning broke over Oakhaven Keep not with bird song, but with the hollow thud of hammers. Servants were rushing to assemble the wedding dais in the great hall, their breath pluming in the damp autumn air. Rowena Hale stood at the narrow window of her bedchamber, watching the frost melt off the battlements. She rubbed her bare arms. Her skin was pebbled with cold. Today she was to be traded to the north. It was a pragmatic arrangement. The northern territories controlled by the Lycan clans had starved out Oakhaven's trade routes for 3 brutal winters. Lord Alden Hale, her father, had finally broken. He offered a treaty, and the Alpha King Garrick Ashdown had demanded a bride to seal it. Not just any bride. Garrick had specified the daughter who wrote the missives. The daughter who had spent the last 2 years negotiating timber rights, winter wheat shipments, and border patrols. Rowena. She turned away from the window, moving toward the heavy oak wardrobe where her wedding gown hung. It was a severe thing tailored from heavy dark blue velvet and stitched with modest silver thread. There was no romance in the garment, just as there was no romance in this marriage. She was a political hostage with a ring on her finger. Yet as she reached for the latch, the door to her chamber creaked open. "You're awake," a voice said. Rowena turned. Camilla stood in the threshold. Her younger sister was radiant, her golden hair already brushed to a high shine by her maids. But it wasn't her hair that caught Rowena's attention. It was the dark blue velvet. Camilla was wearing the gown. The fabric strained across Camilla's fuller chest, the silver embroidery warping slightly under the tension. She stroked the skirts with a manicured hand, her pale blue eyes wide and entirely devoid of guilt. "What is this?" Rowena asked. Her voice was flat. She didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming in Oakhaven only earned you a headache. "Father and I talked last night," Camilla said, stepping fully into the room. She smelled of crushed lavender and rosewater, a stark contrast to the damp draught of the stone chamber. "He agrees that sending you is a mistake. You're the steward of this keep, Rowena. You manage the ledgers. You keep the servants in line. Father needs you here." Rowena stared at her. The audacity was almost impressive. "And you are volunteering to marry a werewolf warlord out of the goodness of your heart." Camilla lifted her chin. "I am volunteering to be a queen. Garrick Ashdown controls half the continent. He's rich beyond measure. They say his stronghold in the High Ridge is filled with gold from the eastern campaigns. They also say he tore the throat out of the last emissary who lied to him." Rowena pointed out, crossing her arms. The chill in the room seemed to bite deeper into her bones. "This isn't a fairy tale, Camilla. This is a hostage exchange. He knows he is marrying the woman who negotiated the trade agreements. We have exchanged dozens of letters. Letters dictated by Father, written by your hand." Camilla lied smoothly. They both knew Alden Hale hadn't looked at a ledger in 5 years. "I am a Hale. The treaty simply demands a daughter of Oakhaven. I am prettier than you, Rowena. I know how to smile, how to host, how to charm. The Alpha King will take one look at me and forget whatever dull conversations about grain tariffs you bored him with on parchment." Rowena closed her eyes for a brief moment. She felt a familiar, exhausting weight settle over her shoulders. It was the weight of her family's endless vanity. She looked past Camilla to the hallway, where her father stood half hidden in the shadows. Lord Alden wouldn't meet her eyes. He was nervously wringing his hands, a habit that always preceded his cowardice. "Father." Rowena called out, her voice cutting through the cold air. "Tell her to take it off." Alden shuffled forward, his shoulders hunched under his velvet doublet. "Now, Rowena, let us be reasonable. Camilla makes a fair point. You are invaluable to the estate, and Camilla, Well, Camilla has the temperament for court life. Court life. Rowena laughed a short, bitter sound. He lives in a military encampment carved into a mountain. He eats raw meat and runs with wolves. There is no court. Regardless. Alden muttered, his eyes darting to the floorboards. The decision is made. I have already sent word to the kitchen to change the name on the sugar-spun centerpiece. Camilla will be presented to King Garrick. Rowena looked at the two of them. Her sister flushed with greed. Her father pale with weakness. A part of her wanted to fight. She wanted to rip the velvet from Camilla's back and demand her right to be the sacrifice. But another part of her, the deeply cynical, bone-tired part, whispered a different thought. Let them. If Camilla wanted to throw herself into the jaws of a wolf for a crown, she didn't understand why should Rowena stop her. Let Camilla try to navigate the violent predatory politics of the High Ridge. Let her find out what happens when you try to charm a man who negotiates with fangs. Fine, Rowena said softly. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. Wear the dress, Camilla. Marry the king. Camilla beamed, stepping forward to grasp Rowena's hands. Oh, thank you, sister. I promise I will send you silks from the capital. I'll make sure father lowers your workload here. Rowena pulled her hands back. Just remember to breathe when the corset digs in. You've laced it wrong. She walked past them, stepping out into the chilly stone corridor. She didn't look back. She made her way down the winding servant stairs, her soft leather slippers making no sound. She found an old woolen cloak in the scullery, wrapping it around her linen shift. She poured herself a cup of bitter leftover wine from the night before and sat on a flour barrel in the shadows of the pantry. The keep above her was alive with frantic energy. The trap was set. The bait had been swapped. Now all they had to do was wait for the wolf. Midday brought the sound of thunder. It wasn't rain. It was the rhythmic, earth-shaking rumble of 200 heavy cavalry riding up the valley road. Rowena stood on the second-floor gallery overlooking the main courtyard. She remained cloaked in her dull brown wool, blending in perfectly with the shadows and the scurrying servants. Below her, the gates of Oakhaven were thrown wide open. The portcullis was drawn up so tight the iron teeth scraped the stone. The courtyard was packed. Lord Alden stood at the centre, sweating profusely, despite the autumn chill. Beside him stood Camilla. She looked beautiful. The blue velvet caught the pale sunlight, and her golden hair was arranged in intricate braids woven with silver wire. She was smiling, practicing the demure upward glance she had perfected on the squires. Then the vanguard rode in. There were no banners, no trumpets, no heralds announcing their arrival. The Lycan Guard simply poured through the gates like a dark tide. They rode massive, shaggy war horses that looked more like draft beasts bred for stamina and violence. The men themselves were terrifying, broad-shouldered, scarred, dressed in hardened leather and dark steel. They didn't chatter. They didn't smile. They formed a perfect, silent perimeter around the courtyard, their amber eyes scanning the battlements, the windows, the shadows. Rowena held her breath as a single rider separated from the pack. Garrick Ashdown. He didn't ride a horse. He rode a beast that looked like a cross between a destrier and a nightmare pitch black, with eyes that rolled white as it snorted steam. Garrick dismounted with a fluid grace that defied his massive frame. Rowena studied him from her hidden vantage point. He was not a handsome prince from a bard's tale. His face was harsh, carved from brutal necessity. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, missing his eye by a fraction of an inch. His hair was dark, cropped, close to the sides, and left slightly longer on top, shifting in the wind. He wore no crown. His authority didn't require a prop. It radiated from him heavy and suffocating. The courtyard fell dead silent. Even the horses stopped stamping. Garrick handed his reins to a guard and began to walk towards the dais. His movements were utterly silent, a predator approaching a watering hole. Lord Alden stepped forward, bowing so low he nearly bent in half. Your Grace, King Garrick, welcome to Oakhaven. We are honored. We are graced by your presence." Garrick didn't look at Alden. His gaze, piercing pale gold, was fixed entirely on Camilla. Rowena watched her sister falter for a microsecond. Camilla's smile tightened. The sheer overwhelming physical presence of the Alpha King was hitting her. This wasn't a noble lord she could manipulate with a giggle and a touch on the arm. This was a killer. But Camilla rallied, dipping into a flawless, practiced curtsy. "My king," Camilla murmured, her voice breathless and sweet. "I have waited long for this day." Garrick stopped a few feet from her. He tilted his head. The air in the courtyard felt as though it was stretching, pulling tight like a bowstring. Rowena leaned forward against the cold stone balustrade, her heart thumping against her ribs. Garrick inhaled slowly. It wasn't an obvious sniff. It was a subtle flaring of his nostrils, a deep draw of breath that sampled the air between them. He stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then he looked at Camilla's face. He looked at the heavy blue velvet of her dress. He looked at her manicured hands. "You are the Hale daughter," Garrick said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated against the stone walls of the keep. It wasn't a question. "I am," Camilla said, stepping closer, emboldened by the fact that he hadn't immediately bitten her head off. "I am ready to depart for the High Ridge, your grace. I have packed my trunks. I am eager to see my new home." Garrick's jaw ticked. He glanced briefly at Alden, who was practically vibrating with nervous relief. The swap had worked. The king had accepted the bride. "The ceremony," Garrick said flatly. "Let us be done with it. I want to be on the road before nightfall." Of course, immediately," Alden stammered, gesturing wildly toward the great hall. "The sept is prepared. The feast awaits." Garrick turned and marched toward the hall, his guards falling into step behind him. Camilla quickly took her father's arm, her face breaking into a triumphant smile. She shot a look up towards the windows, though she couldn't possibly see Rowena in the dark. It was a gloating gesture. "I won." Rowena let out a long, slow exhale. It was done. The king hadn't noticed. Or if he had, he didn't care. Men were simple creatures, even the ones who turned into wolves. A pretty face and a tight bodice were usually enough to erase whatever intellect they thought they valued. She turned away from the gallery. She should go to the kitchens. If they were leaving before nightfall, the travel rations needed to be packed. Salt pork, hardtack, dried apples. Practical things. Let Camilla worry about her velvet trunks. Rowena had a keep to run, but as she descended the stairs towards the lower levels, a strange knot tightened in her stomach. Garrick's eyes. Pale gold. Cold. Calculating. He didn't look like a man who had been fooled. He looked like a man who was walking into a trap purely to see who had set it. Rowena picked up her pace. The great hall of Oakhaven was suffocating. Hundreds of candles burned in the iron chandeliers, heating the damp air until it smelled of melting tallow and roasted pheasant. At the far end of the room, upon a raised wooden dais, stood the village priest. He was a small, frail man, currently clutching his holy book to his chest like a shield. Rowena slipped into the hall through the servants' entrance, remaining near the massive hearth at the back. She pulled her wool cloak tighter around her shoulders. From here she had a clear view of the altar. Garrick stood on the left. He hadn't bothered to change out of his travel leathers. A massive broadsword remained strapped to his hip. Camilla stood on the right, looking entirely out of place in her finery next to the grim warlord. Alden hovered in the background, dabbing his forehead with a linen kerchief. The priest cleared his throat. "We gather here, under the eyes of the divine, to join two houses." His voice shook. He rushed through the opening prayers, terrified that pausing might invite the wolves lining the walls to attack him. Camilla maintained her serene smile, staring up at Garrick's profile. Garrick was looking straight ahead, his expression entirely unreadable. Do you, Garrick of House Ashdown Alpha of the High Ridge, take this woman to be your bound mate and queen?" The priest rushed out. "Hold!" The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken at a normal volume, but it cut through the room like a physical blade. The priest snapped his mouth shut. The faint murmurs from the Hale courtiers died instantly. The Lycan guards shifted their hands, dropping casually to the hilts of their weapons. Garrick finally turned his head to look at Camilla. "Before I swear an oath," Garrick said, his voice echoing in the dead, silent hall, "I have a question for my bride." Camilla blinked, her smile faltering. A question, my lord. A simple one." Garrick turned his body fully towards her. He towered over her, casting a dark shadow over the blue velvet of her dress. "In your last letter to me, dated 3 weeks prior to the harvest moon, we discussed the timber tariffs along the Whispering River. You proposed a compromise regarding the toll checkpoints." Alden made a soft, choking sound in the background. Camilla's face drained of color. Camilla stammered. Her eyes darted frantically to her father, then back to the imposing man before her. "The timber tariffs. Yes, of course." "What was the proposed percentage of the toll?" Garrick asked softly. "And which side of the river would house my inspectors?" The silence in the hall was agonizing. Rowena stood frozen by the hearth. She knew the answer. 12%. The eastern bank, due to the floodplains on the west. It was a brilliant compromise that she had spent 3 sleepless nights calculating. Camilla swallowed hard. "My lord, surely a wedding day is no time to discuss ledgers. I leave such tedious matters to the stewards now." "You leave them to the stewards." Garrick repeated. "Yes." Camilla tried a charming, self-deprecating laugh. It sounded like shattering glass in the quiet room. "I am to be a queen, am I not? I shouldn't concern my mind with lumber and tolls." Garrick stared at her. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. The Lycan guards took one unified step forward. The clatter of their boots on the stone floor made several courtiers gasp and step back. "The woman who wrote those letters," Garrick said, his voice dropping to a dangerous guttural frequency, "spent 2 years fighting me for every copper piece, every bushel of wheat, every inch of border territory. She is brilliant, ruthless, and possesses a mind sharp enough to bleed me dry in a negotiation." He leaned down his face, inches from Camilla's terrified pale face. "She smells like ink-dried sage and stress. You—" Garrick inhaled sharply, his upper lip curling into a faint sneer. "Smell like rose-water, vanity, and lies." Camilla staggered back as if she had been struck. "Your Grace." Lord Alden rushed forward, throwing his hands up. "Please, a misunderstanding. Camilla is a Hale. The bloodline is the same." Garrick didn't even look at Alden. He reached out and grabbed the front of Alden's doublet with one massive leather-clad hand, lifting the lord off his feet. Alden let out a strangled squeak. "The treaty." Garrick snarled the human facade, slipping to reveal the monster beneath. His eyes bled from pale gold to a vibrant, glowing amber. Stipulated the author of the letters. "You attempt to pass off a dressed-up doll in her place. That is an insult to my intelligence and a breach of our pact. I should burn this keep to the bedrock." Swords cleared scabbards around the room. The metallic ring echoed off the high ceilings. Human guards drew their weapons in response, but their hands were shaking. A massacre was seconds away. Rowena couldn't let it happen. She didn't care about Alden's pride, and she certainly didn't care about Camilla's humiliation. But the servants, the kitchen boys, the guards who had families in the village below, they would all die if the wolves let loose. She stepped out from the shadow of the hearth. 12%, Rowena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. In the tense silence, it was as effective as a gunshot. Garrick froze. He didn't drop Alden, but he turned his head slowly. His glowing amber eyes locked onto Rowena across the length of the hall. Rowena pushed her hood back. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She walked forward, the dull brown wool of her cloak parting to reveal the plain linen shift beneath. She wore no makeup, Her brown hair was tied back with a simple leather strip. She looked like a peasant. 12% on raw timber, 15 on milled planks. Rowena continued her voice steady as she walked down the center aisle. The armed wolves parted for her instinctively. And your inspectors would hold the Eastern Bank. The Western Bank floods in the spring, and I refused to pay to rebuild your garrison every year. She stopped at the base of the dais. She looked up at the massive, terrifying warlord currently holding her father by the throat. You didn't answer my last letter, Rowena said, crossing her arms. I assume you found the terms acceptable? Garrick stared at her. The tension in his massive shoulders slowly unwound. The vibrant amber in his eyes began to fade, back to the pale, piercing gold. A strange, low sound rumbled in his chest. It took Rowena a moment to realize it was a chuckle. He opened his hand, dropping Lord Alden unceremoniously to the floorboards. Alden scrambled backward on his hands and knees, gasping for air. Garrick stepped off the dais, walking down to stand directly in front of Rowena. Up close, he was even larger. She had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. He smelled of pine needles, leather, and ozone. He looked her up and down, taking in the cheap wool cloak, the plain clothes, the ink stains still visible on the sides of her fingers. Then he looked past her, toward Camilla, who was weeping silently on the dais in the ruined, ill-fitting velvet gown. You let her steal your dress, Garrick noted. It's a heavy dress, Rowena replied smoothly. And I have a long ride ahead of me. I prefer riding leathers. Speaking of which, if we are leaving before nightfall, we should skip the feast. The salt pork is already loaded on your supply wagons. Garrick's mouth twitched. It was the ghost of a smile. He raised a hand, gesturing to his men. Instantly, the Lycans sheathed their weapons. The threat of violence vanished as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by the sheer commanding gravity of the Alpha. No feast. Garrick agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. Just the vows. He held out his hand to her. It was scarred, calloused, and large enough to crush her skull. Rowena looked at it for a moment. This was the end of her life in Oakhaven. This was the beginning of something dark, unpredictable, and entirely out of her control. She glanced back at her father, who was still coughing on the floor, and her sister, who was staring at her with a mixture of horror and realization. Rowena reached out and placed her ink-stained hand in the palm of the Alpha King. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. Make it quick, Father Thomas. Garrick ordered the trembling priest, pulling Rowena firmly to his side. My queen has packing to do. Oakhaven vanished behind them in a curtain of freezing drizzle. Rowena didn't look back over her shoulder. She kept her eyes fixed on the muddy rut of the northern road, her hands steady on the reins of the sturdy roan gelding Garrick had provided. It was a beast bred for endurance, much like the men surrounding her. They rode in a brutal, punishing rhythm. Lycans didn't stop for sore muscles or a little weather. Rowena understood why they had starved Oakhaven so effectively. An army that didn't need a heavy supply train and moved twice as fast as human cavalry was a logistical nightmare to fight. She mentally filed that information away. Garrick rode at the head of the column on his monstrous black stallion. He didn't speak. He didn't issue commands. A silent telepathic discipline governed his men. Yet Rowena could feel his attention. Every so often the massive warlord would drop back slightly, his horse falling into step beside hers. He never offered a cloak or asked if she was tired. He simply watched her hands, her posture, the way she absorbed the jarring rhythm of the trot. On the fourth morning, a supply wagon lost a wheel in a deep, freezing mud rut. Rowena watched from her saddle as 3 Lycan guards tried to muscle the heavy oak axle upward, their boots sliding in the sludge. They were using brute force. It wasn't working. Rowena dismounted. She didn't ask for permission. She walked to the side of the road, grabbed a sturdy fallen birch log, and dragged it through the mud. Leverage, she said, dropping the log near the wheel. She grabbed a large, flat stone to act as a fulcrum. Put the log under the axle. Push down, don't lift up. You're wasting energy fighting gravity. Guards paused, looking at her, then at Garrick, who sat motionless on his black horse. Garrick gave a barely perceptible nod. They used the lever. The heavy cart popped up instantly. A fourth guard shoved a temporary bracing block beneath it, allowing them to fix the wheel. Rowena wiped freezing mud from her gloves and walked back to her gelding. She remounted without a word. Garrick rode up beside her, his massive frame blocking the biting crosswind. "You have blisters on your hands?" Garrick noted his pale gold eyes tracking the raw skin visible where her gloves ended. "Leather rains and wet weather," Rowena replied, checking her stirrups. "They'll callous over by the time we reach the mountains." Garrick looked ahead at the winding, treacherous road. "Your sister would be dead by now." "My sister would have demanded a carriage, 6 fur blankets, and a halt at noon." Rowena corrected, her voice flat. "You would have thrown her off a cliff by day 2. Garrick let out a low rumble in his chest. It was an affirmative sound. She wanted to be a queen. She wanted the idea of a crown. Rowena said, shivering as a gust of wind hit them. She thought it was just a title. She didn't realize it was a job. And she certainly didn't realize you don't wear gold on your head. Lycans don't forge crowns. Garrick shifted in his saddle, his heavy leather armor groaning. "We follow strength. We follow the one who keeps the pack fed and the borders secure. Pragmatic." Rowena nodded slowly. "I appreciate pragmatism. It's why I negotiated the grain shipments the way I did. You needed winter stores. We needed open roads, a simple equation." Garrick tilted his head, watching her with a newfound intensity. "And what is the equation for this marriage, Rowena?" It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded harsh and heavy in his gravelly voice, stripping away all noble pretenses. Rowena met his gaze squarely. "You wanted a hostage who could manage a supply chain. I wanted out of a keep where I was doing all the work while my father took the credit. You get a steward. I get autonomy. I think we both got exactly what we bargained for." Garrick stared at her for a long, quiet moment. The freezing rain hissed against the leather of their saddles. He didn't offer a romantic platitude. He didn't try to touch her cheek or whisper sweet assurances. He was a monster assessing a very human partner. "Good," Garrick finally said. He spurred his horse forward. "Tomorrow we climb the ridge. It gets steeper. Keep up." Rowena watched his broad back as he retook the lead. She squeezed her numb fingers around the reins. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a piece on someone else's chessboard. She felt like a player. High Ridge Keep wasn't a castle. It was a fortress violently carved into the side of a granite mountain. Massive iron-wrought gates guarded a deep, cavernous courtyard. Thick stone walls fused seamlessly with the natural cliff face. There were no tapestries, no ornamental gardens. Every inch of the place was designed to repel a siege, weather a blizzard, or house an army. They arrived as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting long, sharp shadows across the stone. The courtyard was teeming with activity. Blacksmiths hammered out dented armor scouts, tossed bundles of fresh game onto butcher blocks, and hundreds of Lycans moved with focused, aggressive energy. When Garrick rode through the gates, the noise stopped. It wasn't the fearful silence of Oakhaven. It was a deep, resonant respect. Men and women in the courtyard dropped their tasks, turning to face their alpha. Garrick dismounted, throwing his reins to a waiting boy. He didn't look back to see if Rowena was following. He expected her to. Rowena swung down from her horse. Her legs nearly gave out. 5 days of relentless riding had battered her human frame to the absolute limit. She locked her knees, took a deep breath of the thin, icy mountain air, and followed him up the massive stone steps toward the main hall. Inside, the keep was just as severe as the outside. Huge hearths roared with pine logs, fighting back the bone-deep chill of the stone. Long wooden tables filled the space, scarred by daggers and heavy tankards. A massive man stepped into their path. He was nearly as broad as Garrick, with a thick russet beard and a jagged white scar across his throat. Alpha. The man greeted, clapping a fist to his chest. Bram. Garrick acknowledged. Report. Southern patrols caught 2 scouting parties from the Red River Pack. Dealt with them. Winter stores are at 70%. We need more grain before the pass freezes. Bram's eyes shifted to Rowena. He didn't try to hide his skepticism. He looked at her plain clothes, her tired face, her fragile human scent. This is the treaty bride. This is Rowena Hale, Garrick said. He didn't call her a queen. He didn't demand Bram bow. She negotiated the Oakhaven Treaty. Bram grunted, crossing arms the size of tree trunks. She looks fragile. The altitude will crack her. Rowena didn't wait for Garrick to defend her. She stepped out from behind the Alpha's massive shoulder, looking directly at the russet-haired lieutenant. 70% is insufficient. Rowena said, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of the hall. If you factored in the spoilage rate of the damp cellars I smelled near your lower gates, you're actually sitting at 62%. And if the Red River Pack is probing your southern border, you'll need to increase rations for the expanded patrols. Bram blinked. He looked down at this small, exhausted human woman. How do you know about the damp cellars? Rot has a distinct smell, Rowena replied smoothly. You're storing rye too close to the groundwater. Move it to the 2nd level, or you'll be eating mold by January. I want the inventory ledgers brought to the main solar in an hour. Also, your eastern trade route is bleeding coin. I negotiated a fixed tariff for Oakhaven, but your other human neighbors are overcharging you for salt. I need those contracts too. Silence hung heavy in the massive hall. A few lichen warriors sitting at the nearest tables stopped chewing their meat, staring at the human who was casually ordering their brutal second-in-command around. Bram's jaw worked. He looked at Garrick, clearly waiting for the Alpha to put the human in her place. Garrick was leaning casually against a stone pillar. A slow, terrifying smirk spread across his scarred face. It was a predator's smile, deeply satisfied. You heard her? Garrick said softly. Bring my mate the ledgers. Bram swallowed hard, gave a stiff nod, and hurried off toward the lower levels. Garrick pushed off the pillar and gestured down a dark stone corridor. The solar is this way. Rowena followed him. Torches flickered against the granite, casting dancing shadows. They entered a large room at the end of the corridor. It had a massive fireplace, a heavy oak desk covered in haphazardly stacked parchments, and a large bed draped in thick grey furs. Rowena walked straight to the desk. It was a disaster. Scrolls were piled together, wax seals broken and discarded. She picked up a sheet of parchment, scanning the terrible handwriting. Your quartermaster is an idiot, she stated, tossing the parchment back down. He is a very good fighter. Garrick offered, walking over to the hearth to stoke the fire with an iron poker. Fighters don't keep armies fed. Math does. Rowena pulled out the heavy wooden chair and sat down with a heavy sigh. She reached into a travel pouch, pulling out her own block of ink and a sharpened quill. I'm going to need a second desk, and better lighting. Garrick watched her from the hearth. She wasn't looking at the massive bed. She wasn't crying about her lost home or the harsh conditions. She was already mentally reorganizing his entire territory. Later that evening, food was brought to the solar, not on silver platters, but on heavy iron trenchers. Thick slabs of venison, roasted root vegetables, and a loaf of dense, dark bread. Rowena ate methodically, her eyes scanning the first ledger Bram had delivered. She tore off a piece of bread, dipping it into the meat drippings, never breaking her focus from the columns of ink. Garrick sat across from her. He ate like a wolf, efficient, tearing the meat from the bone, his focus entirely in the present moment. He watched her work. You missed a calculation on the 3rd page, Garrick said, suddenly pausing with a bone in his hand. Rowena stopped chewing. She frowned, flipping back a page. She traced her finger down the column of numbers regarding winter ale rations. I did not, she countered. You're assuming a standard human consumption rate. Your men burn 3 times the calories. I adjusted the multiplier. Garrick tossed the bone onto his trencher. He leaned back, lacing his large hands over his stomach. You notice that? I notice everything that costs money, Rowena said, closing the ledger and pushing it aside to finish her meal. If I don't feed your army properly, they turn feral. If they turn feral, order breaks down. If order breaks down, trade stops. It's a bad investment to starve a wolf. And what about you? Garrick asked. The room was quiet now, the crackle of the fire the only sound. What do you require to keep from breaking down, Rowena? She looked at him. The question wasn't about rations or firewood. He was asking about her terms for this marriage. Behind the heavy oak doors of this bedroom, they were a man and a woman bound by a treaty. I require honesty, Rowena said finally. She didn't look away from his intense, glowing eyes. I spent 20 years in a house built on whispers, lies, and vanity. I won't do it again. If I make a mistake, tell me. If you intend to break me, look me in the eye when you do it. Do not coddle me. Do not lie to me. Garrick stood up. He walked slowly around the heavy wooden table until he was standing beside her chair. He reached down his large, calloused fingers, gently brushing an ink smudge on her cheek. The contrast between his lethal strength and the careful touch sent a sudden electric shock down her spine. No lies! Garrick promised, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that resonated in her chest. You are my mate. You rule my keep. Anyone who disrespects you, I will break them in the courtyard. Anyone who lies to you loses their tongue. We deal in truth here, Rowena. He didn't try to kiss her. He didn't push for a consummation of the vows. He simply gave her his word, sealed in the quiet dark of a mountain fortress. Rowena exhaled slowly, the lingering tension in her shoulders finally melting away. Oakhaven was gone. The high ridge was hers. Snow arrived 3 weeks later, burying the high ridge under 6 feet of solid, blinding white. It didn't fall softly like it did in the southern valleys. It drove sideways a horizontal wall of ice that stripped the bark from the pines and sealed the fortress in a frozen grip. Rowena adapted. She traded her wool cloaks for heavy bear pelts, though she insisted they be cut down and re-stitched so she could actually move her arms to write. Her days became a blur of ink tallow candles and endless calculations. Running a lichened stronghold in the dead of winter was like feeding a furnace that actively wanted to burn the house down. The men ran hot. They possessed metabolisms that demanded thousands of calories a day just to maintain their body heat. And when they were confined indoors by the blizzards, they grew restless. Restless wolves picked fights. Fights broke bones. Broken bones meant fewer patrols on the walls. Rowena solved the problem with cold economics. She converted the lower cavern, a massive empty space, previously used for storing broken siege equipment, into a sparring arena. She didn't just tell them to fight. She structured it. She created brackets. She organized betting pools using brass chits backed by the keep's treasury. And most importantly, she took a 10% cut of all wages for the house. Bram thought she was insane. Garrick simply watched her from the balcony of the arena, his massive arms crossed, a dark smirk playing on his lips. Within a week, the ambient tension in the keep vanished. The brawls in the dining hall stopped. The men exhausted themselves in the ring, placed their bets, and slept soundly. The treasury slowly filled with brass chits. Rowena had weaponized their aggression and monetized their boredom. Late one evening, the wind was howling around the stone towers like a dying animal. Rowena sat in the solar, her feet tucked under a heavy fur blanket, aggressively crossing out lines in the quartermaster's inventory. The door groaned open. Garrick stepped inside. He brought the storm with him. Snow crusted his dark hair and packed the crevices of his heavy leather armor. He had been out on the western ridge tracking a pack of rogue mountain cats that had been harassing their livestock pens. He shut the heavy oak door, leaning his broad back against it for a moment. He looked exhausted. The brutal reality of being the alpha was that the hardest, most dangerous jobs always fell to him. Rowena didn't ask how the hunt went. The fresh, bloody claw marks scoring the hardened leather of his pauldron answered that question. She set her quill down. "Take the armor off before it thaws. You'll ruin the rugs, and I just had the soot beaten out of them." Garrick chuckled. The sound was rough, scraping his throat. He pushed off the door and walked heavily toward the fire. His fingers were stiff with cold fumbling against the frozen iron buckles of his chest piece. Rowena stood up. She walked over, swatting his massive hands away. "Drop your arms!" she ordered. Garrick obeyed, letting his arms fall to his sides. He stood perfectly still as she worked the icy buckles. She was quick and efficient, her smaller fingers manipulating the stiff leather with practiced ease. She pulled the heavy chest piece away, letting it drop to the stone hearth with a dull thud. Beneath it, his linen shirt was soaked in sweat and melted snow clinging to the thick, corded muscles of his chest and abdomen. She reached for the laces of his shirt. He didn't move, but she felt the sudden sharp change in his breathing. The air between them grew dense. Rowena pulled the damp linen over his head. His skin was radiating heat like an oven. The scar on his face wasn't the only one. His torso was a map of old violence, jagged white lines from silver blades, puckered burns, and the unmistakable deep gouges of rival claws. She didn't flinch. She grabbed a dry linen towel from the wash basin and began to dry his shoulders. "You lost 2 men on the patrol," Rowena stated quietly, dragging the rough cloth down his back. Garrick stiffened slightly. "How do you know?" "I saw Bram cross 2 names off the active roster before dinner, Cale and Thorne." She tossed the damp towel onto a chair. "I've already adjusted the grain rations for their widows' households. They'll receive double for the remainder of the winter." Garrick turned around to face her. The pale gold of his eyes was vibrant in the firelight. He looked down at her, searching her face for pity. He found none, just the steady, pragmatic calm she applied to everything. They were reckless. Garrick said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register. "They broke formation to chase a stray cat into a ravine. The ice gave way. They were fools then," Rowena replied, easily meeting his gaze. "But their widows shouldn't starve because their husbands lacked discipline." Garrick reached out, his large hand wrapped around her jaw, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. His skin was rough, calloused, and blistering hot. "You don't weep," he observed softly. "You don't flinch when I come back covered in blood. You just fix the ledgers. Tears don't put food on the table, Garrick." She didn't pull away from his touch. "And flinching doesn't heal wounds. You run the pack, I run the keep. We both have our jobs." "Is that all this is?" Garrick asked, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "A job." Rowena looked at the monster she had married. She looked at his scarred face, his lethal hands, the heavy weight of command that bowed his shoulders. She realized with a sudden quiet clarity that she didn't just respect him. She felt safe with him, truly deeply safe. Not because he was gentle, but because he was entirely honest in his brutality. "No," Rowena admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not just a job anymore." Garrick didn't ask for permission. He closed the distance, his mouth finding hers. There was nothing tentative about the kiss. It was heavy, consuming, and grounded in a desperate need for warmth against the freezing dark. Rowena kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands gripping the thick muscle of his arms, anchoring herself to him. The political hostage and the warlord. 2 cynical survivors finding exactly what they needed in the dead of winter. Midwinter broke with a false thaw. The ice melted just enough to turn the mountain passes into lethal slick mud before freezing solid again overnight. It was during this brief window that a rider arrived at the gates of High Ridge. Rowena was in the courtyard, inspecting a new batch of iron-tipped arrows with Bram when the gates shrieked open. The rider wasn't Lycan. He was human, shivering violently in a cheap wool cloak, riding a horse that looked half dead from exhaustion. Rowena recognized the crest stamped onto his frozen leather satchel, the stylized oak tree of her father's house. She felt nothing. No surge of homesickness. No anxiety. Just a mild annoyance that her morning inventory was being interrupted. Bram stepped in front of her instinctively, his hand dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. "State your business." The massive lieutenant barked. The rider practically fell out of the saddle, his knees hitting the frozen mud. "A missive for the Queen, for Lady Rowena, from Lord Alden Hale." Rowena tapped Bram on the shoulder. He stepped aside, though he kept a suspicious glare locked on the shivering messenger. She walked forward, pulling off her heavy leather glove, and took the sealed parchment from the man's trembling hand. The wax was cracked from the cold. "Go to the kitchens," Rowena told the rider. "Tell the cook to give you a bowl of the marrow stew and a bed near the hearth. Do not wander the keep. My men get nervous around strangers." The man nodded frantically and scrambled away. Rowena didn't open the letter in the courtyard. She walked back up the massive stone steps, moving past the guards who bowed their heads respectfully as she passed. She headed straight for the solar. Garrick was sitting at his own desk, sharpening a hunting knife against a whetstone. The rhythmic shh-shh sound stopped as she entered. He saw the broken wax seal in her hand. "News from the south?" he asked, not looking away from his blade. "A letter from my father," Rowena said, sitting in her chair. She broke the rest of the seal and unrolled the stiff parchment. She read it in silence. The fire cracked in the hearth. Garrick went back to sharpening his knife, giving her space. The letter was exactly what she expected. A masterpiece of pathetic manipulation. Alden wrote of a disastrous harvest. He wrote of Camilla's delicate constitution failing in the damp Oakhaven winter. But buried beneath the flowery prose and the appeals to family loyalty was the real truth: Oakhaven was bankrupt. Without Rowena there to balance the books, collect the tolls, and ration the stores, Alden had spent their reserves trying to maintain a wealthy facade. Neighboring lords had smelled the weakness. The eastern border was being contested. They were out of money, out of grain, and out of options. Alden was begging. He wanted Garrick to send a detachment of Lycan warriors to intimidate the neighbors, and he wanted Rowena to send gold from the High Ridge treasury to cover his debts. Rowena read the letter twice. Then she laughed. It was a sharp, dry sound, devoid of any real humor. She tossed the parchment onto the center of her desk. Garrick stopped sharpening his knife. He set it down, walked over and picked up the letter. He read fast, his amber eyes scanning the desperate scrawl. When he finished, his upper lip curled in disgust. "He sold you to me to save his keep," Garrick rumbled, tossing the letter back down. "And now he wants you to pay for his survival with my gold. He wants family duty," Rowena corrected, leaning back in her chair and resting her chin on her hand. "He thinks because we share a name I am obligated to bail him out of his own incompetence. Camilla likely helped him write it. The handwriting is hers. She always looped her Y's too aggressively." Garrick leaned over her desk, planting his massive knuckles on the wood. "I can march south in 3 days. I can take 200 men, rip the gates of Oakhaven off their hinges, and drag your father out by his hair. I can give you the keep. You can run it from here." He meant it. There was no boast in his voice, just a factual statement of military capability. He was offering her revenge served on a silver platter with a side of absolute violence. Rowena looked at the scarred hands resting on her desk. She imagined her father dragged through the mud. She imagined Camilla forced to face the reality she had tried so hard to avoid. It was a tempting thought. "No," Rowena said quietly. Garrick raised an eyebrow. "You forgive him. Forgiveness requires emotional investment. I have none left for him." Rowena pulled a blank sheet of parchment toward her and picked up her quill. "War costs money, Garrick. It costs lives. Marching men south depletes our winter stores and leaves the northern passes vulnerable to the rogue packs. Oakhaven isn't worth the calories your men would burn walking there. Then we ignore it, let them starve. We don't do that either. Rowena dipped her quill into the inkwell. A cold, pragmatic smile touched her lips. Oakhaven controls the eastern grain fields, the same fields Olden is currently failing to protect. We need grain for the spring campaigns. She began to write. Her handwriting was sharp, precise, and completely unsentimental. I am offering to buy the eastern fields, Rowena explained as the quill scratched across the paper. Outright, for 20% of their actual value. It will be just enough coin to pay off his immediate debts and keep Camilla in velvet for another year. But he signs the land over to the High Ridge forever. He becomes a tenant on his own border. Garrick let out a low whistle, crossing his arms. That is extortion. That is business. Rowena countered, signing her name at the bottom with a decisive flourish. He begged for a lifeline. I'm giving him one. It just happens to come with a noose attached. She melted a stick of black wax over the candle, dripping it onto the folded parchment. She pressed the heavy iron seal of the Alpha King into the wax, leaving the imprint of a snarling wolf. She held the letter out to Garrick. Have Bram give this to the messenger in the morning, and make sure he packs him a hardtack biscuit for the road. I don't want him dying before he delivers my terms. Garrick took the letter. He looked from the black wax seal to his mate. The pride in his pale gold eyes was blinding. He didn't just love her. He was in awe of her. You, Garrick murmured, leaning down to press a hard kiss to the crown of her head, are infinitely more dangerous than I am. Spring breached the High Ridge not with gentle sunbeams, but with the violent roar of melting ice. Waterfalls carved new channels into the granite, rushing down to swell the rivers below. The mud in the lower valleys grew thick enough to swallow a pack-horse whole. It was the absolute worst time to travel the northern passes. Yet a miserable, battered carriage dragged itself up the mountain road on a bleak morning in early April. Rowena stood on the upper ramparts, wrapped in her heavy bear-pelt cloak, watching the struggling horses through the miserable sleet. Beside her, Bram leaned on his broadsword, his russet beard catching the freezing rain. Looks like Oakhaven colours on that broken axle, Bram noted, spitting over the stone wall. Should I have the archers put the horses out of their misery? No, Rowena said, her breath pluming in the cold air. Let them through the gates, but do not offer them a fire. Bring them straight to the great hall. An hour later, the massive iron-wrought doors of the hall groaned open. Rowena sat at the head of the heavy oak table. Garrick sat beside her, his massive frame relaxed into his chair, a mug of hot, spiced ale in his scarred hand. He wore a simple tunic of dark wool, but the lethal energy radiating from him made the room feel uncomfortably small. Lord Alden Hale stumbled into the hall, looking half dead. His velvet doublet was stained with weeks of road mud and dried vomit. His face was hollowed out, the arrogant flush of the southern lord, replaced by a sickly, terrified pallor. Behind him limped Camilla. Rowena felt a strange detachment looking at her younger sister. Camilla's golden hair was a tangled, greasy mess. The fine leather boots she wore were ruined, the soles flapping with every step. She clutched a dirty wool blanket around her shoulders, shivering violently as the ambient chill of the lichened stronghold settled into her bones. They stopped in the center of the hall. Dozens of lichen warriors were scattered at the surrounding tables, sharpening blades, repairing armor, or simply eating slabs of rare meat. Hundreds of amber eyes locked onto the human intruders. The silence was absolute. Alden swallowed hard. He looked at Garrick, then his gaze slid to Rowena. He blinked clearly, struggling to reconcile the plain, exhausted steward he had sold off with the woman sitting before him. Rowena wore a fitted tunic of hardened leather over a grey wool dress. A heavy silver chain, the mark of the Alpha's mate, rested against her collarbone. She looked healthy, sharp, and utterly untouchable. Rowena. Alden rasped, his voice cracking. Daughter. Lord Alden. Rowena replied. Her voice was flat, carrying no familial warmth. You are off your lands, and you failed to pay the toll at the Whispering River checkpoint. Alden flinched. We have nothing left to pay with. You took it all. I took the eastern fields as collateral for your debts. Rowena corrected, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the heavy oak table. A generous offer that you signed in the presence of my courier. Did you lose the rest of the estate already? Camilla stepped out from behind her father. Her pale blue eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. She looked around the grim, brutal hall, her gaze lingering on the massive, scarred men who looked ready to tear them apart. Then she looked at Garrick. She tried to straighten her spine, tried to find that practiced, charming smile that had always served her so well. It failed miserably. Sister, Camilla said, her voice shaking. Please, the winter was so hard. Father couldn't manage the ledgers. The servants left when the coin ran out. We are eating boiled roots. Boiled roots are nutritious, Rowena stated, if you forage properly. You cannot do this! Camilla's facade cracked, desperation bleeding through. She took a step toward the dais. Instantly, Bram and two other guards stepped into her path, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons. Camilla scrambled backward with a choked sob. We are your blood. You sit up here in a fortress warm and fed while we freeze in the dark. You abandoned us. Rowena let out a slow, deliberate exhale. She picked up her own mug of ale, took a sip, and set it down. I abandoned nothing, Rowena said quietly. The hall was so silent her voice carried to every corner. I kept Oakhaven standing for 5 years. I starved myself to ensure the winter stores lasted. I stayed awake for days, calculating your debts, your tariffs, and your vanity projects. You wore silk while I scrubbed ink off my fingers. She stood up. She walked around the table, moving past Bram and the guards. She stopped 3 feet from her sister. You wanted this crown, Camilla, Rowena said, gesturing to the cold stone around them. You stole my wedding dress. You lied to a king. You begged for a throne you didn't understand. I simply let you have exactly what you asked for. The only difference is I survived the wolf. You couldn't even survive the winter. Alden dropped to his knees. The damp stone floor cracked sharply against his bones. Mercy, Rowena. I am an old man. Let us stay. We will work. Camilla can learn to sew. Garrick finally moved. He set his mug down with a heavy thud. He stood up, towering over the room. The casual, relaxed energy vanished, replaced by the terrifying apex predator that had conquered the high ridge. He walked down from the dais, coming to stand right behind Rowena. He didn't look at Camilla. He looked down at Alden. You sold my queen for a treaty! Garrick rumbled, his voice vibrating in the chests of everyone in the room. You tried to cheat me with a lesser substitute. You proved you have no honor, no intellect, and no strength. There is no place for you in my mountains. Please, your grace. Alden wept, clasping his hands together. Bram, Garrick commanded. Take them to the lower courtyard. Give them 3 sacks of oats, a fresh wheel for their carriage, and 2 heavy cloaks. Then escort them down the mountain. Alpha. Bram acknowledged with a sharp nod. He grabbed Alden by the back of his dirty doublet, hauling the old man to his feet as if he weighed nothing. Camilla stared at Rowena, tears spilling over her pale cheeks. You are a monster. No, Rowena replied, smoothly turning her back on her sister. I am just a very good accountant, and you are no longer my liability. Summer came to the high ridge late, but it arrived with a fierce, blinding beauty. The granite peaks caught the golden light, and the lower valleys exploded into a sea of sharp green pine and purple mountain heather. Trade was booming. The eastern fields, now firmly under the management of High Ridge stewards, produced a bumper crop of spring wheat. The human lords to the south, having heard whispers of Oakhaven's pathetic collapse and Rowena's ruthless acquisition, quickly paid their tariffs on time. No one wanted to test the human queen who commanded the wolves. Rowena sat on the balcony of the main solar, a heavy ledger resting on her knees. The air was warm, smelling of pine sap and roasted meat from the courtyards below. She dipped her quill into a silver inkwell, carefully drawing a thick black line through the final debt entry for the southern borders. 0. The keep was entirely in the black. The heavy oak door to the solar opened behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the heavy, quiet footfalls of her husband. Garrick walked out onto the balcony. He was shirtless in the summer heat, his scarred skin gleaming with sweat from a morning spent sparring in the arena. He carried a plate of sliced apples and hard cheese, setting it down on the small iron table beside her. He leaned against the stone balustrade, crossing his arms and watching her work. Bram just returned from the southern patrol. Garrick said, picking up a slice of apple. He says Oakhaven Keep has been fully abandoned. The roof of the Great Hall caved in during a spring storm. Alden and Camilla are living in a merchant's townhouse in the lower village. The merchant took them in out of pity. Rowena didn't look up from her ledger. She blew gently on the wet ink to dry it. Pity is a terrible currency. It runs out faster than gold. Does it bother you? Garrick asked softly. She finally closed the heavy book, setting it on the table. She looked out over the vast, rugged expanse of the high ridge. She saw the sentries pacing the walls, the blacksmiths working the forges, the merchants haggling over furs in the lower bailey. This was a brutal place built on violence and pragmatism. But it was honest. It was a machine that worked, because she kept the gears oiled, and Garrick kept the predators at bay. No. Rowena answered truthfully. It feels like balancing an equation. Everything is exactly where it belongs. Garrick moved closer. He reached down, slipping his large, calloused hands under her arms, and lifted her out of the chair with effortless ease. He pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around her waist. She rested her hands on his shoulders, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath the scarred muscle. You are a cold woman, Rowena Hale. Garrick murmured, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. The rumble of his voice sent a familiar shiver down her spine. Rowena Ashdown. She corrected him, tilting her head back to look into his pale gold eyes. And I am not cold. I just reserve my warmth for things that matter. Garrick smiled. It was a rare, genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. He kissed her slow and deep, pulling her tighter against him, until the stone walls of the keep, the ledgers, and the world outside entirely faded away. They had bargained for survival. They had traded in hostages and treaties. But as the summer sun dipped below, the mountain peaks casting long shadows across the fortress, they ruled together. They both knew they had secured the greatest victory of all. They had found an equal. If this cynical, slow-burn romance kept you hooked until the very last drop of ink, hit that like button and share the video with your fellow fantasy lovers. Do you think Rowena was too harsh on her sister, or did Camilla get exactly what she deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another dark, grounded, and deeply human storytelling adventure. More ruthless queens and dangerous warlords are coming your way soon.